Okay, let's just start by addressing the elephant in the room, shall we? Redfall has been absolutely demolished by both critics and consumers for just about everything, from the brain-dead enemy AI, generic mission design, and the fact that the game is just blatantly unfinished and still requires more work to get it to a mostly decent technical state. I don't disagree with any of these criticisms, actually. I believe they're perfectly valid. That being said, I have found and am still finding enjoyment out of my experience with Redfall after completing my first playthrough of the campaign after 40 plus hours. I know this video is releasing way after the initial launch, but I felt it would be unfair of me to judge Redfall and give my initial thoughts without seeing and experiencing most of what the game has to offer, both good and bad. Redfall is a flawed game from top to bottom, make no mistake of that. And even though I personally have had fun playing through the game, and I am continuing to play it for the foreseeable future, I might as well let all of you know right now what my final verdict is, as it stands currently. I unfortunately cannot recommend this game to anyone right now in its current state, especially for a full-priced $70 AAA title. If you have access to Redfall through Xbox Game Pass, or if you're already a devoted Arcane Studios fan like myself, it might be worth playing once the game has had significant performance and gameplay updates. For now though, Redfall is a disappointing stumble from my favorite game developers of all time, and even though I personally can find many redeeming qualities about the game, I cannot ignore what is right in front of me. Despite all of that, you should expect to see me continue my ongoing coverage of Redfall well into the future, regardless of how positively or negatively that coverage may be received. So for those of you who have been waiting patiently to hear my in-depth thoughts about Redfall, wait no further. Let's start by talking about the PC version of Redfall, which I played through, its performance and optimization problems, and the prevalent bugs and glitches scattered throughout. Right off the bat, I'll just say that the AAA games industry has an incredibly bad habit of releasing broken and unoptimized PC ports, and sadly, Redfall follows this trend. My PC is not the most powerful rig in the world by any means, but the fact that I regularly dip well below 60 frames at regular intervals is inexcusable when I know that my machine can run other, far more graphically intensive games at over 120 frames steadily. Redfall runs on the now infamous Unreal Engine 4, which historically has provided serious issues with shader caching and micro and macro stuttering. Just look back to something like the Callisto Protocol, another AAA game running on UE4 that had similar stuttering and shader caching issues at launch. Despite having enjoyed that game thoroughly, I even made a video on why you should check it out, it ran terribly, and all of the problems can be traced back to Unreal Engine 4 utilization. Redfall experiences many of the same problems. There's some serious stuttering in the open world where your game will just completely lock up for several seconds or even minutes at a time, or the frame rate will chug at about 10 to 20 FPS in certain areas. There's tons of texture pop in, and sometimes the textures can take upwards of 5 minutes just to fully load, or sometimes they don't even load in at all. There's this strange flickering effect with the outdoor foliage, specifically the trees scattered around the map. There's a ton to dislike about Redfall from a performance and optimization angle, and this doesn't even get into the bugs and glitches I ran into, because holy moly, this game is super buggy. Enemies will clip through walls or objects and get stuck there. Plus, they can shoot back at you while they're clipping. Some of the vampire enemies won't display their health bars properly, causing you to shoot at them and realizing that they're literally unkillable, and also they've become domesticated and they'll just follow you around like innocent puppy dogs. These two examples are the worst and most immersion-breaking bugs I ran into during my time with Redfall, but trust me when I tell you there's plenty more to see. Not focusing solely on the negative aspects, let's move on to discussing the gameplay, the open world, and the enemy AI during combat. Gameplay in Redfall is pretty solid, or at least I think so. Weapon feedback is very different from Deathloop in how it feels, but it's still fun to fire your guns at the vampires and cultists. A lot of the way the gameplay feels can most likely be attributed to the team at id Software assisting Arcane Studios during the production of Redfall and providing their decades worth of first-person shooter expertise. There's many different weapon varieties scattered around Redfall, including your standard pistols, shotguns, sniper rifles, and assault rifles, and all of them feel satisfying to use, except for the Morrigan, which is just awful and requires some major rebalancing and tuning. Each of your primary weapons has a stake attachment at the end, which allows you to finish off a vampire once you've whittled down their health meter and left them in a vulnerable state. Let me just say that this is one of the most fun aspects of the game in my opinion, because the feedback and audio design during the staking animation is just incredibly slick and satisfying and never gets old.
It's on me!
You also have access to specialized vampire hunting weapons in the form of the stake launcher, which fires everyday objects that have now become lethal projectiles, and it will often one-hit kill most regular vampires you encounter in the early hours of the game, and the UV beam, which petrifies vampires, turning them to stone and allowing you to finish them off with a swift punch. There's also the flare guns scattered around the coastal island that can ignite your blood-sucking opponents, turning them into ash in an instant. Each of the 4 playable characters also have a set of 3 special abilities that they can use to their advantage in gameplay. For my first solo playthrough of Redfall, I chose Jacob Boyer, who fits into the stealth playstyle quite nicely. His Raven companion can be sent out to tag nearby enemies, letting you know where they are while you sneak around. The cloak can be activated during stealth to make yourself completely invisible, and can also be used to get out of a tight spot while you're in a tense firefight. Jacob's ultimate ability, Heartstopper, summons a spectral sniper rifle that will automatically lock onto enemy heads for quick and easy kills, and using this ability when you're facing a large group of enemies is when it works wonders. At the time of this writing, I've only really dug into Redfall with Jacob as my character of choice. I have spent a few hours with both Layla and Remy in co-op, but I haven't spent enough time with the other characters, or spent enough time in co-op to form a concrete opinion on how I feel about those aspects. Now, the gameplay of Redfall is fun and engaging for the most part, and also in spite of itself. Why do I say this? Well, it's because the enemy AI in Redfall is some of the sloppiest I've seen in any game ever. In most of my combat encounters, the human AI in particular was just largely non-functional and completely incapable of putting up an interesting fight. The vampires are thankfully much more engaging, as their moveset is a little more varied than the human cultists, but they still manage to share the exact same behavior pattern. They just run at you in a mostly straight line while trying to take a few swipes or pot shots at you. When the special vampires enter the fray, whether that be the Shroud, the Siphon, the Angler, or even the hulking Rook, and you're having to fight them as well as your standard human enemies and standard vampires, this is when the combat in Redfall is most stimulating, because you're forced to use every tool at your disposal just to survive. You have to use a combination of your weapons, abilities, and various environmental hazards scattered around the map, which makes combat less of a situation where you go into autopilot and more of a tense and harrowing situation where you're fighting tooth and nail. Now, for the first several hours of the game, at least, this will not be the case, and unfortunately, most of your combat engagements can be easily maneuvered through without much thought, as your enemies will be mostly brain dead and non-responsive to your actions, which does not give a great first impression. I feel that this might be part of the reason why many people have been harshly judging the game. That reason being that not everyone might have made it to the second open world map called Burial Point, where the gameplay becomes much more interesting and you're fighting enemies in larger groups and larger numbers. Most people were just slogging through the game in Redfall Commons, which is the first open world area. area. The places in Redfall where you're likely to find the most challenging content are the procedurally generated vampire nests, which will appear periodically throughout the open world and allow you to venture into twisted psychic spaces where vampires lie asleep in the blood trance, hiding some of the best loot and gear you can find. You'll often get swarmed by several vampires at once while traversing the nests, as when you wake up one enemy from the blood trance, all other enemies will flock to your current position, and it can be very easy to get overwhelmed as a result. This might be another bug though, because why would all the enemies in the nest know exactly where you are so they can bleed you dry? Maybe there's a lore explanation for it, but it seems a little bit strange, so maybe they can fix this issue later on to make the nests a little bit more balanced in terms of their gameplay experience. Speaking of the open world, while many critics have deemed it to be empty, vapid, and completely devoid of anything interesting or worthwhile to see, I strongly disagree with this stance. I found during my own time with the game that the two open world maps of Redfall are some of the most interesting and visually distinct game worlds I've ever wandered through. Now take this for what it's worth, because I am a self-professed Arcane Studios fan, but there's just something about the way their worlds are designed and how grounded they feel that is so different from any other studio and how they create their games. And I also personally find Arcane's design of their worlds to be far more captivating than the competition. Redfall is a fictional island town in the real-world state of Massachusetts right here in the USA, but it looks and feels like a genuine and tangible location. It really does feel like a small New England hamlet, complete with the coastal harbors and lighthouses, the packed suburban communities, and the old brick and mortar downtown areas. Redfall, much like Arcane's previous game worlds, feels incredibly lived in and real, much more so than their previous games, I'd actually argue. That's due to the grounded reality of setting this game in an analog to real-world Massachusetts, as opposed to a more fantastical setting like Dunwall or Karnaca. You can tell just by walking down a main street that this was a place where people lived and went about their typical daily routines, just like your standard small American town. Arcane's game worlds have always had a strong sense of place, and Redfall is truly no different in that regard. It also helps that there's tons of secrets and environmental storytelling to find as you explore the different areas of the map. In Redfall, you're always rewarded with something for investigating each and every location, or at least that's how I personally feel, because not everybody is going to find the environmental storytelling or loot to be worthwhile. At the very least, you can see that Arcane wasn't lying when they said that the open world was truly handcrafted, and every inch of the explorable space has a unique fingerprint attached to it. Many of the interiors are so visually distinct and different from the next, and the actual topography of Redfall can shift drastically from coastal piers and harbors to lowland neighborhoods and towns, and all the way up to highly elevated mountain peaks. There's a strong sense of verticality in the world of Redfall, and this is an aspect of Arcane's world and level design that continues to improve with each new game, in my opinion. Building off of what we discussed with respect to the sense of place and immersion in Redfall, let's talk about the main story and narrative of the game. The setup is that vampires have taken over the small island town of Redfall, Massachusetts, raised the waters surrounding the island, thereby creating an impenetrable wall preventing any escape attempts, and also have blocked out the sun in a never-ending eclipse. As one of the 4 playable protagonists, you and up to 3 other players are tasked with ending the vampiric infestation, while also uncovering how this happened in the first place. The narrative that is present here in Redfall is definitely much weaker than Arcane's previous efforts, but the premise is intriguing, and it provides the player with a mystery that is interesting to solve at the very least. None of the characters outside of the 4 main heroes and the vampire gods are particularly interesting or noteworthy, sadly. Most of them just kind of boil down down to set dressing. However, they do help to fill out the world and further immerse you in the setting, assisting in aiding your sense of place in Redfall. Much of the story is told through the main missions, where you'll encounter psychic echoes left behind by the vampire gods, revealing their backstory and how even though they turned into literal monsters, these people were always monsters from the beginning, way before they became actual vampires. One of the main themes present throughout the narrative in Redfall is how people with unchecked wealth and influence can carry their selfish endeavors too far, endangering the lives of thousands, maybe even millions of people in the process. The rich and powerful rarely have any empathy for anyone or anything that isn't themselves and their own selfish needs and desires, and these people will do just about anything to get what they want. It's a strong parallel drawn to our own reality, but here in Redfall it is taken to an extreme and unsettling conclusion that involves one of the oldest mythical creatures in folklore and literature. Featuring vampires as the main threat may lead you to believe that Redfall has a strong survival horror influence thrust upon it, but that simply isn't the case. Instead, Redfall's atmosphere and overall tone is one built out of tension, dread, fear, hopelessness, and just a tiny splash of horror. But it's not a overtly scary game, even though it has its fair share of spine-tingling moments, especially when you're navigating through homes or buildings that are absolutely drenched in blood, or when you're making your way through some of the first vampire nests you encounter, with their visual and aesthetic designs strongly influenced by something like the Upside Down from Stranger Things. The atmosphere of Redfall also helps to make the lore and world building more interesting, as these are vampires created by way of a failed science experiment, combined with, without spoiling anything, just a hint of the supernatural. Reading all of the notes scattered throughout the different areas of the open world also give you more of an idea of what Redfall might have been like, and provide valuable insight into the lives of the people who lived there. With all of my initial impressions and thoughts being laid out in front of you, I want to now circle back to what I had mentioned at the beginning of this video and reiterate to all of you my verdict on Redfall as it stands right now. Even though I've enjoyed my time fighting vampires and exploring the open world, I would be lying to myself and, more importantly, my viewers if I said that I recommend this game, because the truth is that I can't recommend this game in good faith while it is in its current state. As a full-priced $70 AAA game, it falls way short of earning that price tag as well as your monetary investment. As an Xbox or PC gamer, getting Game Pass just to play Redfall is not worth it currently, even though you aren't paying a dime. Despite all of that, I do hope that Xbox, Bethesda, and Arcane Studios at least make an effort to fix, update, and polish this game, because I truly do believe there's something good here hidden under all of the bad aspects. As an Arcane Studios game, it's easily one of their weakest titles, although I would stop just short of calling it completely terrible or unredeemable, and I will also stand firm against the criticisms that Redfall is a soulless experience, because the concept of the game itself, regardless of how well it's been executed here, is pretty original and inspired, and so are the character and art design in many ways. I would love to see this game have a comeback with proper fixes to the enemy AI, the graphical and PC performance optimization, and maybe some more interesting mission design, along with the previously announced forthcoming DLC characters for those who bought the deluxe edition of the game. I feel, as a longtime Arcane Studios fan, that we are owed a complete experience with Redfall, and I can only hope that not only will Arcane communicate to myself and their most passionate players what the future plans for the game will be, but I also hope that Phil Spencer and the team at Xbox will devote some much-needed resources to getting this game to where it should have been at launch. As of the time of me writing this script, there hasn't actually been any communication from Arcane, at least on social media, about when we can expect to see Redfall's first major patch, which has been pretty disheartening, even though I'm still trying not to lose hope. Sadly, for many people, the damage here has been done, and for them, no amount of fixes or updates will ever get anyone interested in Redfall again. They may be right to just move on and let Redfall die. Let Arcane Austin work on their next big AAA game. I myself, though, forever being an optimist, sincerely hope this won't be the case. So these are some of my initial thoughts and first impressions after playing through Redfall and completing it, but now I want to know what you think in the comments down below. Do you agree or disagree with any of my thoughts on the game? Have you played it yet, or will you just skip it entirely? Will you wait for fixes and patches to be released for Redfall, or do you think the game will be left in its current state? Sound off and let's have a civil and constructive discussion. I don't want to see any negativity in the comments, guys. Come on. If you enjoyed this video, please make sure to leave a like and share the video with other members of the Bethesda and Arcane Outsiders community. It really helps the channel to grow and get noticed. Consider subscribing to the channel for more Redfall content in the future, and be sure to hit that notification bell so you never miss an upload. And remember that the outsider walks among us. Thanks for watching, everyone.